and welcome to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Manny Maradiaga, live today on July the 8th, starting another week with some more stories around the NFL, mainly focused on a lot of quarterback talks and a lot of things surrounding quarterbacks. We're going to start off by mentioning Cam Newton, and on his latest episode of his podcast, seeing where Dak ranks among the highest paid quarterbacks in the NFL. What he said about it, who'd he take over Dak and who'd he take Dak over, are all going to be included in the first segment. We're going to go over that. Then, in the second segment, Patrick Peterson talked about the defensive back market and how he doesn't agree on why there are so many high-caliber veteran defensive backs still left over. We'll touch on that. And then also, the more on covering Hard Knocks offseason, more on the Giants and some of the conversations that they had, considering adding Christian Wilkins at one point this offseason. That was mentioned in episode 1, and I thought I'd bring it up here again. So those topics and a lot more on today's show. As a reminder before I start, if you have any questions or comments you want to make, use the tip and donations link, GSMCPodcast.net. By using that, I can see your question in my chat box. That way, I'll read it on air and get your guys' thoughts on anything I say or on any of the topics. It's a massive help for this show and the network, so please, if you would, use the tip and donations link, GSMCPodcast.net. In saying that, though, I'm going to go right into Cam Newton and ranking Dak Prescott among some of the highest paid quarterbacks in the NFL. Last Wednesday, in that episode of 4th and 1, if you didn't know, that is the name of Cam Newton's podcast. He talked about it towards the end a little bit on how Dak Prescott stacks up to some of the highest paid quarterbacks, because obviously now it's been an ongoing thing that Dak is trying to get a contract negotiation done with the Dallas Cowboys. Ideally, I guess, for the Cowboys, but the biggest issue is the price. What do you pay Dak Prescott? Do you pay him on what has he done for you lately for just the Cowboys? What has he done for the Cowboys? Do you pay him based off of that, or do you pay him based on the market? And according to some of the other quarterbacks that are getting this amount of money, should Dak also be getting that if you consider him a better quarterback than those guys? So one by one, Cam Newton and some of the and his co-hosts went through the list of the top 10 highest paid quarterbacks and determined who they take over Dak Prescott and who they value, or who they have Dak valued over them. And I have them actually here. I have the quarterbacks that Cam Newton would approve of Dak being over. So who he would take Dak Prescott over are these 5 quarterbacks that he mentioned. He said that he would take Dak Prescott over Trevor Lawrence, over Kyler Murray, over Jalen Hurts, over Justin Herbert, and Kirk Cousins. Those are the 5 quarterbacks he said he would take Dak Prescott over. And on the flip side of that, just to get them all out there for you guys, the quarterbacks that he said he wouldn't take, that he wouldn't have Dak over are Patrick Mahomes, Joe Burrow, Lamar Jackson, Jared Goff, and Deshaun Watson. Those are the top 10 highest paid quarterbacks currently in the NFL. And looking at the list, looking at the highest paid quarterbacks and what Cam had to say about it, who'd he have over them and what these quarterbacks are saying just based off of them. I would agree with mostly everything that Cam Newton said, just based on his analysis and who he listed on there, except one switch. I would make one switch, but it involves 2 quarterbacks, obviously. I would switch just Deshaun Watson and Jalen Hurts, just because I feel like Jalen, I don't feel like it. He has been to a Super Bowl. He had a very successful season in 2022. Yeah, he dipped a little bit last year. The whole team did. It wasn't a great situation, but Deshaun, since getting the money that has elevated him to top 10 status, has hardly played and hasn't, played great thus far for the Browns. And they've played just as good, I believe, with Joe Flacco in there last year as well, making the playoffs. Yeah, they got smacked around by the Houston Texans, but they at least got there with a guy that played the last 5 games. It just says a lot about how talented the rest of the team is, and Deshaun hasn't really, up until this point, the last 2 years, lived up to that, in my opinion. So, but talking more specifically about Dak and how he stacks up to these quarterbacks, I'll go over to the last slide and who would Cam Newton take Dak over, these 5 guys. If you look at them, and just break it down a little bit. The biggest flaw that people bring up about Dak is his playoff performances, right? With a good team in the Dallas Cowboys over the last few years, at least in the regular season. You look at that playoff record, he's 2-5, 14 touchdowns to 7 interceptions, 2 interceptions in each of the last 2 playoff games that he has also played. Dak Prescott, both of them being losses, obviously. And you look at that list and comparing just playoffs, because that is ultimately what I consider a big factor in getting you this amount of money in the NFL. If you look at it, I would only take 5 quarterbacks on that list ahead of Dak Prescott in terms of playoff performances, in my opinion. And those 5 quarterbacks would be obviously Patrick, Joe Burrow, Jared Goff. I would take Jalen Hurts, even if his record in general isn't, that of Patrick or that of Joe Burrow. He at least has made it to a Super Bowl and arguably could have won it. So I would take Jalen Hurts over Dak just based on playoffs. And also I would take Lamar. He has a losing playoff record, but he just got to the conference championship, something Dak has never done. They are right at their peak, I think. If anything, maybe getting better. So those are the 5 quarterbacks I would take also in terms of just playoffs. And if you look at the other guys, all these 4 except Jalen Hurts, if you put in Deshaun Watson, those 5 quarterbacks I would not take over Dak because of the playoff. If you're talking about just playoffs, comparing these 5 guys, Deshaun Watson included in there instead of Jalen Hurts, to Dak Prescott, it's not that different than what it seems like on paper, at least. You look at some of these 5 quarterbacks, most of these quarterbacks, only 5 of them don't have a better playoff record than a 500 record in the playoffs. Personally, none of them have a better playoff record than just that of 500, and combined, all 5 of them have a 3-9 playoff record together compared to Dak's 2-5. So personally, just individually with their own teams, none of those quarterbacks have more playoff wins than Dak is one thing. And in that same breath, Dak has played in more playoff games personally, individually, than all those quarterbacks at the same time. He is older than most of them, but again, looking at just playoff performances, the numbers don't really have a huge divide or a huge difference in them when you're really breaking them down. And in that same breath also, he's been in more playoff games than Kirk, Kyler Murray, Trevor Lawrence, Justin Herbert, and Deshaun Watson. Has more wins than them, like I mentioned, also being older. And after that, just based on the quality of who's getting paid this $50 million, $55 million, $56 million, maybe eventually, Dak makes a great argument that he should be in that conversation if we're just going off of who is getting paid this money. Not so much of what he's done with the Cowboys. If we're just going off of the market and what the market dictates, he should be getting it because Trevor's getting it, Kirk's up there, Justin Herbert's up there, Deshaun Watson's up there, and he's performed better in the playoffs than them, and arguably in the regular season than all of them as well. So it's hard to argue with that. Dak should be in there, but the biggest point of all of this is that I don't think it should be with the Dallas Cowboys. It just doesn't add up. They've run their course together. As a marriage, they've run their course, I believe. It's just not working out, in my opinion, between the Cowboys and Dak. He should get that money. I believe he will get that money, but again, I don't think it should be with the Dallas Cowboys because it'll do them more harm in the long term than it'll do them good. Yeah, you'll be able to keep your franchise quarterback, the guy that's been really through it all, injuries, contract negotiations, trying to beat this narrative of the Cowboys in the playoffs. He's been there in the highest and the lowest of moments, but if you're just getting stuck at the same spot over and over again, at some point someone's got to say that, this just isn't working out with both of us combined as a duo. We'd have to split up. I think they've come to that point, lining up with the contract that they are on right now. And again, it's tricky because it goes back to that point on should you pay your quarterback just based on what he's done for you and your team or just on how the market dictates. And I think a lot of teams do it just based on the market rather than considering how significant it is paying him based on what he has provided to your team, because Dak is worth that money, I believe, just based on the market. But for the Cowboys, you could say that he isn't because he hasn't gone over that mark and has stuttered and has performed pretty bad in those moments for the Cowboys. in the playoffs that have cost them in big moments, throwing 2 interceptions against the Packers this past playoffs, 2 interceptions against the 49ers, and the one previous to that. You could argue that the Cowboys shouldn't pay him because with them, he has not performed up to that standard, but based on the market, he should be up there. So that's where it gets a little bit tricky, deciphering between what he should be paid on based on how he's performed for Dallas or just on the market. I think he hits free agency and probably some other team pays him. The Raiders have been thrown around a lot. Maybe even the Giants, if it doesn't work out with Daniel Jones, could be something interesting to look at. I'm sure there's other teams I'm not thinking of just off the top of my head, but those are the conversations that I'm sure they're having, and I'm sure they're getting stuck on as well. The mindset of some of these teams, and this is the last point I'll make, is that having a quarterback that's just at a mid-tier level that is doing all right with you and just paying him and over-relying him, I think is a big gamble that it seems unnecessary at times for some teams, because it's almost like if you pay a quarterback, it's almost like handing in your test to be graded. You have to double check everything. You have to make sure everything's in line with the support, with everything, the weapons that you have around them, the protection, and all those things. You have to make sure all of that is in check, at least in my opinion, and then you can hand your test in to be graded. Because once you hand that in, once you hand that pass for people to start judging you, and once you have a lot of money riding on all of this, then comes harsher criticism, harsher looks on your team for making that decision to hand it in early, and then it just looks bad and you're stuck in a rut and trying to restart this whole thing. It isn't something that a lot of teams would want to go into, obviously, but a lot of teams do. So to avoid that, I think Dallas should just not pay him because it doesn't fit with them. He'll get that money because he has earned it based on who else is getting it, being better in the playoffs and just overall than all those quarterbacks. But I just think it's run its course with Dallas, and they probably will not end up paying him by this point. So that will be that segment. We're going to head into our first break, and when we return, we're going to talk about the free agent market, this time regarding defensive backs. Patrick Peterson had his opinion to say on it. Stay tuned to find out what he said and why I believe defensive backs, especially veteran ones, are not getting the looks that a lot of people anticipate them getting at this point in the offseason. So don't go anywhere. You're listening to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.